I'm gonna kick you guys out now. And now I am going to let B in. So don't worry, no one's gonna get stung by a bee. It's B-B-E, not B-E-E. And hello, and someone's a Nicki Minaj fan. Let's see. There we go. We've got audio. Someone's a Nicki Minaj fan.
And hi, and we could do both. I mean, I could go with or without the other E.
Let's see. There we go. We've got audio. Okay. If you can actually bring Nicki Minaj into the chat, that is going to be so great for our ratings right now.
Okay, cool. I just had to mute the other stream because the delay I was having too much fun with the delay. I just want to check again. I just made some changes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm going to check in Twitch chat. Can everyone hear us okay? It seems like if I can hear you, I've found all day, if I can hear you, everyone else can hear you.
Okay, so my plan here, my hopefully not too evil plan is to start slides and
yeah, I am going to just let you, I'm going to give the floor to you.
Okay.
Cool. So I'm going to change the view here. There we go. And so I love your backdrop, by the way.
Oh, thanks. Oh, you're talking about my future business partner. Yeah, we've got
I told you, if you can bring her into the chat, that's going to be so great for our ratings.
Yeah, give us a few years. So, okay, so with that said, I'm going to switch over.
You've got the floor now.
All right, then I will present. And sometimes Zoom likes to jump around, so it might take 1 or 2 tries. And let me share the screen. And okay. It would, so yeah, Zoom did not like the fact that I started the presentation first. All right, so now I'm gonna switch over without presenting first. Jumping between Mac desktops, and here we go. And I will share this and present. All right, so I think we might be sharing now. We might all be able to see this. So I'm going to keep this in a different format from what I originally prepared because of a number of fun plan changes. I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a founder, and we we have to change plans a lot. So that said, this talk is about how we win, and I'll get into what winning means. But the basic foundation of the talk is to explore what neurodiversity could mean for belonging, security, and village, whatever those mean. I'll also touch on those. And again, assuming we can all see these things, I will continue to speak to what's on the screen. And in a few slides, I'll stop using the slides at all and share about these topics from experience. There will be a few times, or I'll invite people to share questions and complaints if we can work that out, Kim, and if not, no worries, I can hold those to the end. So that said, a quick overview. As Tanya Janka mentioned before, I'll take the same technical writing approach. I'll tell you what I'm going to tell you. I'll tell you, and then I'll tell you what I told you if there's time. And a quick reminder for those of us who took or taught technical writing, it is closely related but different from taking karate. All right, so the overview for this talk is really straightforward. 7 small sections. One is the introduction. We've got a definition of some key concepts for about 20 minutes or so. Some time for question and complaints for about 5 minutes. There's a topic surrounding complexity STEAM. There's a topic about recommended research. And the last two are more complaints and questions, and an advisement to stay learning and practice. Now, for all of these time frames, there's a tilde next to them. One, because they're approximate, and two, because I appreciated her role in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. All right, so next up. So intro, hi, I'm B. I'm fine if you call me B as in, BE as in the, the English verb to be, or the insect bee. Either way, I have a deep appreciation for them. I'm Black and I'm vegan. And contrary to some of the presenters earlier, I don't identify as being qualified for any of the things I'm about to share. I'm not qualified for this talk and not qualified at all, really. I've been a security hobbyist since around '91, and I've been working professionally, including security, since around 1998. And lest we forget, also I'm vegan. There's a photo here of me. You may or may not be able to see, but through the glasses and mask that I'm wearing, I'm smiling, and I'm very appreciative to be here. And thanks, Kim, for your role in making all this happen. All right, so some definitions, and this is where I'm going to stop sharing and get into a space that is comfortable for me, which is I'm going to have my outlines, and I'm going to share with you from the kinds of work that I'm doing as part of both POC and DEI.dev relating to security and all of these key concepts that this talk is centered on. And now I'm just switching back to those notes if my system will let me get back there. And here we go. All right. So the first topic for definitions here is diversity. If we're going to talk about neurodiversity, I feel it's helpful to get into this base concept of diversity. Like diversity, what is it good for? And one of the oldest topics out there in life on this planet that relates to diversity is basically better sex. The concept of meiosis, if you remember back to maybe high school or middle school, some of us might have studied about cellular division and sexual reproduction. And the concept of meiosis in the natural world is relatable to many of us who study computer science as part, well, it can be seen as a part of how life ensures diversity, so that the next generation is not identical to the previous generation, and to do that more quickly than what might happen from chance encounters with the environment itself and so on. And one of the benefits of having that diversity in the natural world, which has analogs in the kinds of security that we've been talking about during much of this event, part of the benefit in the natural world is that when the members of your group or your species are not all alike, then you have different susceptibility to different types of biological vulnerabilities, like different types of disease, bacteria and viruses, and a lot of common talk, or these days we have models for prions and chemical contaminants and all of that not so fun stuff. In the same way that if you're responsible for a fleet of vehicles, or you're responsible for a small or large deployment of computer systems, devices, if all of your devices are identical, then in some ways they might have the same kinds of vulnerabilities, the same kinds of exploits. And so when we're talking about diversity of systems, when we're talking about diversity of life, and when we're talking about the different ways of showing up as a person, specifically neurodiversity, we're not just talking about the mental health contexts, we're not just talking about medical contexts, and we're not just talking about what tends to show up when we're exploring topics of insurance. We're talking about the resilience of how we show up. And when it comes to neurodiversity in particular, I tend to say that it takes all kinds. You know, we've got a little noise in the background, so I'm going to try and pace it to account for that a bit. But essentially, we might need to have different ways of thinking, different ways of feeling, different ways of understanding concepts in order to innovate. And and so the later topics uh, we talk about neurodiversity, and we talk about how that figures into the things that we create, and who uses them, and how we design things, and what the real impacts are. Uh, just keep in mind that diversity is a big part of how we learn collectively. And another key definition here is belonging. You know, in that subtitle, we have not just this of neurodiversity, you know, and diversity in general, uh, but belonging. And what does belonging mean? So in part of my work, I work at the intersection of, uh, you know, technological innovation, as well as innovation in process and operations and collaboration. So when I'm talking about belonging, I'm coming from a space of doing the work to make sure that we're looking at how we welcome each other to show up more fully, whether that's at work or in our business relationships otherwise, when it comes to product design, you know, making sure that clients belong. When it comes to negotiations, making sure that the frameworks of language and the terms of agreements are considered thoughtful, and that we have clear and meaningful boundaries that look out for everyone's safety in lots of different ways. And a continuing theme in this talk is looking at security, also in the vein of safety. You know, personal, psychological safety, physical safety. These are also aspects of security, and they also figure into this notion of belonging that often we might come across in discussions relating to diversity, equity, and inclusion. DEI, that whole space, as much as lately we've been talking about it in terms of gender identity, orientation, and race, it applies really deeply and intersectionally to neurodiversity, which applies to all of humanity, and you know, basically all of life that has that has nervous systems, basically nervous systems and brains especially. And so when it comes to these questions of who and how we show up, one of the most important ways that belonging figures in is making sure that we can tap into our different abilities. You know, we don't get the benefits of diversity if people can't show up and bloom, so to speak. If people can't show up and share from their experiences, share from their awareness, share from their different ways of connecting with the subject matters at hand, and to bring in subjects, concerns and questions, and even other people that the rest of the team might not think to introduce, or might not initially value. Belonging relates to the processes and the operations that we collectively ensure are in place, so that no one person takes on too much of the work of belonging, too much of the work of making sure that we can all participate in whatever it is that we came together to do. And I've touched on this a little bit before, but security by any other name. So part of the research that I'm involved in, and part of the public communications I'm involved in with DEI.dev, with USC, and with other teams and initiatives, is looking at security and recognizing that there are a lot of ways that we deal with security but don't call it security. And principally, and this is one of the key tenets of DEI.dev, that whole notion of belonging I touched on earlier, that whole notion of diversity and inclusion, through previous work, we establish and maintain that learning work, that learning work and practice, this collaborative learning work and practice of DEI and belonging, it is the work of security and resilience. And part of how we help people to explore that and question it, challenge it, learn it, potentially practice it, is by pointing out the different ways that security shows up in our lives that we're not used to talking about. Now, in circles where we have tech talks and presentations about, AppSec and DFIR and so forth, a lot of times, by virtue of how we work with language, many of us we're gonna look at security, and some of us more than others are gonna get locked into a particular emotional context and cognitive context, but we're thinking about computers. We're thinking about, networks. We're thinking about, documentation. We're thinking about staying safe online. And this matters. This is important. But it's also not complete. And part of the complexity of this work, and the reason that this is even a topic to define, is that for the rest of this talk to make sense, we've got to broaden that definition a little bit. So I want to make clear that when I'm talking about security, I'm talking about security in the ways that it might have applied before we had, the internet as well. Before we had these computers, I'm looking at notions of safety. I'm looking at notions of cognition and welcome. I'm looking at, as I touched on before, topics of psychological safety and security, which matter for teams, which matter for whether we feel that we belong, whether we feel how we feel that we can contribute, and how welcome our contributions are, and the time and cost of all those benefits that I talked about earlier, of benefiting from diversity, benefiting from our broader capabilities of collective work. And when it comes to security, since some of us have probably seen and heard and otherwise experienced the earlier talks, you've probably heard a lot. So you might have heard a lot about the technological kinds of security. So I'm not going to spend much more time talking on those just yet. But I will mention in that space, Tanya and others have talked about, for example, DevSecOps. I think this is a helpful progression before I wrap up this definition topic. It's a helpful progression to think about the history, the very brief history of DevSecOps, in that in earlier days of computing, there was a lot more discovery about the foundation of computing and basic hardware, and hey, let's work out networks and let's have more people start to use these things. And as more people started to use these systems and services, and I'm not going to tell you where I show up in all of that to date myself just yet, any more than I already have, but in order for us to look back and appreciate how we got to DevSecOps and why it matters and what's next, I find it meaningful to look back and say, hey, there was a time where there were no developers. There was a time where people were figuring out how to program and how to do it reliably, and how to do it repeatably. So out of that grew what we now can recognize as development and what's called the SDLC, the software development lifecycle. We've also since then had enough people and enough different types of people using different types of devices, again, device security and, device diversity and experience diversity from all of these. From that, we've built an awareness of the implications of our security stances and notions of resilience, because we've experienced what it means when someone basically consumes all the resources of a website or shuts down other people's abilities to use an application, whether it's denial of service or malware, otherwise, etc. We've had the experience of seeing new people interact with our services in different ways, and now we have this history where, hey, we might want to include security pretty early on. Now, in my work and in this presentation, I strongly recommend these types of integrated approaches these types of lean approaches that look at security from a more holistic standpoint that, as others have mentioned earlier, includes everyone in the team in different ways, so that the work of that is spread out, and so that we don't have unnecessary blind spots, so that we can focus on acknowledging the necessary blind spots and doing the work of belonging, so that we can minimize the harm of them, or the potential harm of them, and the harm that we might do without it. And as we get, if we go back to that historical context for DevSecOps, I will just point out there was a really quick transition getting from development to DevOps, which includes operations. From a business standpoint, that makes sense to me that we want our developers having not just familiarity with infrastructure, with operations, so that they understand, so that developers understand what happens with what they build in order to make sure that the outside world or other users can use it. If we have that increased awareness of the context of what we build, then that can inform how we build it. And there's kind of a, in French, we call it, it's not the vicious circle, it's the, well, we call it, we call it basically a, oh, it's another kind of circle, but it's very nice. It feeds back into itself. And pardon?
What's that?
That's a reminder for some time I set aside that needed to be deleted. So that said, it's ultimately helpful for, in the same way that it's helpful for operations to be spread out a bit more across the team, so that it's not all on one person or one department, with everyone else potentially in the dark and letting that person or department be a bottleneck. Our learning from that is reflected in the existence of DevOps, that we have engineers or developers who understand operations and can speak for the role it has in the business more broadly, understand how scaling works, and understand how that might figure into application design. Now, the next step in that, from our earlier discussions, is DevSecOps. Now, DevSecOps is a similar kind of progression where we look back and we say, okay, well now, in the early days of computing, we didn't experience so much in the ways of exploits because there weren't as many people online. And not everybody had the time or the inclination to even mess around with other people's systems or to break things by introducing bugs, which, in many cases is kind of indistinguishable from an exploit. But that said, now that we have so many people online using so many different devices, there is a lot of work that goes into understanding what's even possible, both from a harm perspective and also a protection perspective. And then more broadly, from just understanding, like, hey, what are our options space? And when we made that transition, some of us, because it's still relatively new, we're talking like less than a decade of people really using these expressions, especially DevSecOps. Well, we made that transition from DevOps to DevSecOps, some of us. Many of us have also brought a lot of the learnings from technology's iterations. Now I'm gonna take, I've got one more slide before I'm gonna ask for some questions, but I really wanna impress upon us this progression because it's gonna come up once or twice more. We're getting from development. We've got developers separate from folks who handle infrastructure and in some cases networking, the earlier days of the internet, and getting into closer to the present day where, hey, more and more people have DevOps. We've got things like Docker, if you're familiar. We've got different ways to make development faster and easier and more portable. It's helpful to not have to separate those things and be maybe more inefficient now that we have, again, the tooling and the broader community support to let people show up, as both developers and those who understand ops, And so that last progression, getting into what others have mentioned earlier, getting from DevOps to DevSecOps, it's not just security that needs to be spread out across the team. Is not just security that everyone needs to have some familiarity with and some practice with and some accountability for. It's important, but that security just like the development, just like the operations, it has to come with the related concepts of basically lean approaches. So in our formulation of DevSecOps, which some folks call lean security, we strongly encourage lean approaches, which some people may recall from pre-existing concepts like lean business, lean operations, etc. But lean security in the DevSecOps sense, in part means that we're not assuming unlimited resources, and we're not assuming we're all working with experts. And that's a very innovation supportive way, because in many ways we have to innovate. We have to make it up as we go, because we're going to discover new things. We're going to discover things that don't have a well-established solution. And in those spaces, which are arguably we're all in, you know, despite how we model it differently. So in all of these cases of discourse, if we're looking at ways to be efficient with the resources, you know, we don't have infinite money, we don't have infinite time, and we don't have infinite spoons. We don't have infinite capacity to keep things in our minds, which again varies from person to person and even moment to moment. Given those limitations, lean approaches are all about balance. They're all about essentially making sure that not only is the work of development, the work of security, the work of operations spread out across the whole team in different ways, but also making sure that the way that we make plans together is a learning approach, making sure that we focus on data-driven approaches toward what many of us might be hearing about lately as observability. You know, making sure that we have smaller goals that more people can understand easily, so that you don't have a silo of one or two people that understands what's going on at a high level, and it's easier to bring in other folks as needed. So that's security in terms of the definition for this talk. I just want to highlight that we want to include the system security, we want to include application security, network security, but we also want to include physical security, facility security, psychological security, and the more general types of security, because as we'll touch on in a moment, that matters deeply for really doing, you know, being as aware and effective and efficient as we can be together. And that brings me to the very last slide before this break that I'll recommend, which is it's about village, you know, defining village. And I'm calling it village, you know, the original Black. So we talk a lot these days about the new Black, and the basis for that for many people is in the fashion world, where, you know, for many people, Black is very forgiving, you know, that there are a lot of things you can do with Black, and, you know, it stands out with so many other approaches to light and color and design. And so a lot of people will talk about the new Black, not just, you know, orange is the new Black was a kind of a tongue-in-cheek approach to the naming of that series, but also we hear about lots of different kinds of the new Black, which is typically in jest about a new, fashionable, or interesting approach. And this slide, this definition of village is a bit of a throwback, because I'm going to suggest, and this is central to a lot of the research that I'm involved in, and kind of the, you know, very close to the heart of this talk. Village might be one of our most impactful inventions, and it might be one of the most effective and resilient approaches to ourselves, you know, the problem of us, the opportunity of us, of people. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that, you know, and I'm going to tailor it for the available time here. So these days we focus a lot on essentially following impulse. We focus a lot on getting what we want. It's used as a measure of success in many spaces. And one of the challenges of modern life is that not everybody has the same idea of how to use our limited resources, how to make use of our shared spaces, and how to engage together when we all have slightly different wants, and we can't always recognize even when we have the same kinds of wants, because we all have different styles of expressing, engaging, and hearing about what's going on. And so in the face of this kind of broader challenge, which matters to notions of security as well, I propose that village, which for me, I propose that village is an already established approach. It's a framework in which, from generation to generation, each village across lots of different cultures typically has these few aspects in common that are potentially really helpful for security and resilience, for belonging, for thriving, for the kinds of winning we might talk about. And one of those aspects of village is that the village essentially operates like a living organism. The village is self-sustaining. So that notion of self-sustaining and sustainability applies for the whole village. In a lot of contexts, historically, the village coordinates in order to ensure that there's sufficient food, to make sure that new people who maybe haven't lived through all the seasons and circumstances of others are brought into understanding about the ways of the world and the habits, the aspects of culture, the sharing of information to help people to practice before there's a need to respond. Now, in a lot of security contexts, we talk about the importance of practicing, whether it's through topics you might have heard of, like capture the flag, or other ways of engaging in an educational and also sometimes fun way to test and hone our skills. Well, Village has had that since long before we even had English, and that's a crucial part of how we ensure that we don't suffer from the bias of individual experience, because one of the ways that we gain from Village together is that we're able to, for each new person, Village helps ensure that they're able to integrate the knowledge and learning of the past, so that they're not starting from scratch and having to fail so many times and maybe not even survive before potentially reaching success. So part of the value of Village is the resilience that comes with the self-sufficiency and the investment in shared awareness. Another aspect of Village that I'll highlight before we take this break, since we don't have too much time left, is so in many villages, there are storytellers. There are people who have a relationship with the past stories. These days they might be seen somewhat as librarians or public speakers or mentors in different ways, and that role can be distributed across families and cultures and so forth. But many villages have a person or people that help people to have a relationship of context. And sometimes that context comes from practical skills, stories about where the village came from, which we might call myth or legend, but which help establish a comfort and a welcome and belonging, so that the rest of the things that the village might need or discuss fit well for that person's experience. It's one of the things that we might be lacking today, in which in many cases we kind of get carried away with one size fits all when it doesn't. And I'm going to leave the rest of Village talk for after this. I would like to take a moment and check in with Kim. I would like to, since we
take another 20 minutes if you want.
Well, I was thinking, I want to check in for questions first. If there are no questions, then I can continue. But otherwise, I'd like to set aside maybe 5 minutes for questions before I go in and put the pieces together about, like, why are we talking about these things? So I don't know if on Twitch and on, what is it called? YouTube, if there are any questions, I will.
Are you checking on your phone like me? I
Oh,
check Twitch and YouTube out, but mute your phone because the feedback,
oh
if you
yeah,
have it playing, is like insane.
stellar. Okay, yes. So I'm checking, and let me just go here really quickly. Oh, there we go. And thanks Kim for emailing all that information. Okay, I totally, okay. There we go. Okay, so I don't see any questions. Oh, thanks for the support about the evil plan earlier. And so I think we're good. I don't think we have any questions. So I will carry on. And if there are questions, we might have time at the end. All right. So getting back into this. So I'm talking about Village, the original Black. There is value in looking at the parts of us that are not so, that we don't readily relate with technology. Things like cognition, things like how we listen. We've talked earlier, not in this talk, but in others' talks, about empathy. And empathy is something that is practiced in part through Village. It's practiced through dealing with different kinds of people in different kinds of circumstances. And sometimes we learn about empathy through reading or through stories. We learn about circumstances that we don't come across in our own lives, and we exercise our ability to empathize sometimes through those means. And so this is part of the importance of story, and it's part of the importance of training in modern life. It's part of the importance of the kinds of accountability that allow us to show up together and work together while minimizing harm in both our working teams, our relationship with the outside world. Let alone how we work together to model and mitigate risk through, approaches like threat modeling, and there are a lot of behavioral approaches that we can describe a generalization of that shows up not just in technological security, but in organizational security. So I'm going to move on from those definitions, and I'm going to touch on a notion some of you may have heard of called complexity, especially complexity science. And let's see here. Or it's sometimes called complex systems. One of the impactful, one of the meaningful aspects of complexity science is that it challenges us to counter and question the walls that we've put up between the different academic disciplines and between the different professional distinctions, which is really important if we're talking about, for example, belonging, if we're talking about how there might be security for us to show up together, working as a team, or if we're talking about how we model threats in a modern technological setting, where those threats could include inside actors. Could include someone that's part of your organization. They could include someone that's outside of your organization that may be anticipated to different degrees. Being able to navigate across the potential learning, the potential expertise of modern times, and not get too focused in one corner, sometimes allows us to recognize connections and efficiencies and possibilities and feasibilities that we might discount if we're too focused. And one of the things that I've experienced a lot working in areas that have identified a need for security, as we tend to talk about it, is that sometimes we bring together a lot of experts. And one of the big challenges of expertise that we learn about in psychology is that sometimes if you think you're an expert, it's harder for you to really learn. sometimes it's harder to listen. And in some cases, we encourage that by expecting experts to not listen. And these figure into how we might want to do things differently when we want to really foster welcome and belonging and participation, because we need participation from lots of different kinds of people if we're going to be able to model all the different kinds of threats that might matter, or if we're going to find a way to model and plan together, if we're going to find a way to be accountable together and to look at data together, that allows us to be okay in some way that we can all acknowledge, then yes, we generally are going to want to have more ideas from more perspectives. And so this complexity science, this set of, I wouldn't call it a discipline, but basically you can call it an interdisciplinary discipline if you like. It's an exercise in somewhat a wilderness where we're able to draw on mathematics and psychology. We're able to draw on biology and chemistry. We're able to learn from many of the different traditions culturally, you know, even from culinary tradition, to not just anticipate what might be going on or interpret it more easily or quickly, but also to communicate about it in myriad ways, communicate about what's going on with lots of different kinds of people who might be impacted. And that's one of the key concepts of security that relates so deeply to this notion of belonging, because if we're, for example, if we're designing a system, if we're building an app, for example, beyond how important it is that our engineering team or the whole company be able to show up fully at work and be supported and heard, and you know, contribute at our best. Beyond that, it also matters. It also matters for example, the outside world. You know, if we're not allowing for the different types of folks, the different types of people, and the different aspects and perspectives that our application might need to support, if we're not welcoming those people fully, then in certain ways we're introducing a bias into the feedback that we use to improve. We're introducing a bias into the metrics that we use to even decide whether we're being useful or not. We're introducing bias into our ability to be more broadly aware. And we're not necessarily tapping into our broader abilities to learn and grow together. And that opens the door for security vulnerabilities. One of my colleagues in a prior team often reminded us that bugs are in some ways indistinguishable from exploits, and there's also established theory correlating bugs and security vulnerabilities. But there can be bugs in code, and just like there can be bugs in code, there can be bugs in process. There can be bugs in operations. There can be bugs in cognition. And when we start talking about, if we go back a bit and we start talking about, you know, security in security as relating to how we navigate bugs and how we compensate for bugs, and make sure that we can have bugs, you know, so that we're not paralyzed on the development side. It's okay to have bugs, right? To an extent, we have to make sure our processes are in place so that we're more likely to catch them, and to make sure that all of our processes are unified in that goal of resilience, by one, again, making sure that we're not unnecessarily excluding different types of perspective from our team, or from how we welcome people to use our products and services, because they're an important part of that feedback, and they're also an important part of why our organizations might exist, which is a broader topic that we could get into that relates to you know, motivation and finance and you know, cognition and all that fun stuff. But in complexity science, we can readily connect and meaningfully connect in ways that translate outside of this space, the bugs of our cognition, individual bugs, to collective bugs in our team. And when it comes to, how do we make a process that's more resilient for the future? How can we spend less money to be safer? How can we help the broader public be safer without spending lots of time and money unnecessarily? What even defines what's too much? What defines what would be optimal? In order to ask those questions in a meaningful and durable way that might be less subject to next week's discoveries, we have to make sure that we're welcoming people. We have to make sure that we're supporting people, and that takes work. Um, I mention complexity science because the people who are doing this work are giving whatever your expertise. We're basically laying the framework so that you can come in with your focus, which might be on math, or it might be on art, or it might be on dance, or it might be on farming. You can come in and you can see analogs of your work elsewhere. You can see people step through, like, debugging farming, debugging fashion. You can see the similar processes in different aspects of life coming together, so that you can see how your work translates into what you can do differently to be more okay, not just for yourself, but for your entire community, your entire nation, or even the world. And this all relates back to sustainability, which we don't have time for. And in the last 10 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about what winning might look like, in the context of this talk and maybe beyond it. I would like to, first of all, I want to thank everyone who's participated, earlier, for sharing about their different perspectives on, security and stance and resilience and collaboration, empathy. All of these questions matter. And when we bring all of these questions together and we start looking at, if we want to move the dial, so to speak, if we want to shift from making maybe impulsive and reactive decisions based on limited experience, like individual experience, and we want to shift more to making integrated and, maybe allowance-focused planning and strategy that is informed by many people's experiences and stories and imaginations and abilities across different ways of cognition and thinking and feeling and showing up at work or in teams or in relationships. We want to make that shift. A few things are really consistent, basically no matter what discipline you're in life, or which disciplines you're familiar with, no matter which languages that you speak, no matter what your human interface might be with other people. And one of these takeaways is that we currently might be putting too much emphasis on individual wants and impulses at the expense of everyone's survival. Now, if we want to talk about, technological security context, well, that in part means that, we can see that in, for example, the Silicon Valley stereotype, where so many companies are looking for a particular kind of person to fit a particular kind of role, and they build these cultures of homogeneity that they don't recognize as homogeneity because they're homogenous. And they don't have an established practice to break outside of that cycle. And so what they build is ultimately harmful in ways that the group either doesn't recognize or is not supported to highlight and follow through. That's where we've come from. And we've talked about this more publicly in recent times, just the harms that happen when we get too focused on one particular set of experiences, or one particular individual's experiences, or one particular group's experiences. when we don't look at the dynamics of choice and impact outside of the group that's making the decisions, we don't incorporate all that crucial learning about what the real impact is outside of what we're asking for, outside of what we're looking for, and outside of what we're measuring. There are tools and teams out there that focus on observability because we have a deep need for observability, as in transparency and data-driven approaches where possible, so that different people, whether they're in your team or outside your team, can look at what's going on and can readily understand it, assess it for its impact, and also keep the team accountable, so that whatever we say our goals are, whatever we say we're about, it doesn't take so much work for someone to assess the extent to which that might not be the case, or how that might be shifting, and how to navigate change in a way that's less expensive in terms of people's time, energy, effort, and well-being. Lastly, since we're basically right at, we've got about 4 minutes and some change, I'm only going to talk about one more aspect of this shift that has stood out to me in my work. So, for example, I have done this work in so many different scenarios over the decades. So sometimes people might feel overwhelmed about what can I do about what's going on in the world, whether we're talking about network security and asymmetric threats and the silent cyber wars that are going on right now. Some people might feel overwhelmed, and I find that relatable. And there are some people out there that don't feel overwhelmed. And no matter where we show up on that spectrum, so there are intersecting spectrums as well of people that care and people that are just like, that's them. I would argue that all of that is part of the diversity, that's part of our broader learning, and the ways that we have to collectively benefit from all of that, even the stuff that we can't stand, the ways that we have to collectively benefit to make safer communities and safer systems that harm less and support harm less. The ways that we have to do that, they come about by, one, establishing the practice of centering the wellness of the group beyond the wellness of just the individual. They both matter, but it's important that we also integrate a practice, whether this is a family practice or a team practice at work, or a community practice, or some blend. It's clear that this work cannot be done solo across all the different types of people, all the different types of neurodiversity out there. Not everyone can learn in the same ways. And someone who might be able to read a book cover to cover in a matter of moments still might lack the emotional work to actually launch that code in themselves, to actually run it in a way that they can be accountable to someone outside of themselves. There's a social component to the complex work of learning and growing together, and that is missing. And we're potentially getting there slowly, but part of the research I'm working on is how to make sure that we establish belonging immediately and quickly, so that we can survive ourselves and maybe even thrive together. So we're at basically time, and so I'm gonna hand the mic back over to Kim, and maybe I'm up for questions and all that if we have them.
Feel free to answer questions. You are the last talk of the event, so I'm more than happy to give you another 10 minutes if you want.
So I'm gonna check again. I'm gonna check YouTube since I'm not signed into Twitch right now.
I gotta say, I really enjoyed your talk. I love both sociological and psychological aspects of the hacker community and of cybersecurity. I think the kind of ideas that you were discussing about our community are not talked about often enough.
Yeah, it's yeah, thanks. It's I think it, although we understandably tend to talk about it in terms of the struggles, the pain, and the challenge of it, I feel that it is at once also kind of a hint. It's a clue for opportunity. Um, I I I think in some ways, like looking back across different aspects of complexity science, that there are ways that you can look at systems almost like living organisms. And you know, there are some systems in play among people that demonstrate a lot of characteristics of biological organisms of life as we model it. Like for example, self-preservation. A lot of the systems in the world of people preserve themselves. The ones that have been going on for decades and centuries and so forth, we find ourselves protecting those things because they're what we've known. And if we want to make or if I'm going to make this redonkulous metaphor here, um, I might suggest that those systems run uh, essentially and predictably on kind of the margins of the cognitive biases of us. You know, we don't have a personal relationship with the confluence of our choices collectively around the world. You know, it doesn't show up in a way that we can talk about easily using our language, which is based on, hey, I can see this in my space. You know, we can talk about fruit pretty easily. We can talk about food pretty easily. We can talk about sleep and a lot of common behaviors really easily. But when you start talking about food at a global scale, then you start losing people. Like, wait, what? Billion, what? You know, when we start talking about choice at scale, we start losing people. You know, we don't, well, there are some things that many of us um, don't think about in a lifetime that are still impacting all of us. And there are some things in that whole space that some of us, even if it's brought to our attention, we might need to take more time to process them. We might need to take more time. We might need different ways to learn them, just like Tanya spoke on earlier. There are many ways to learn, and in a given team, there may be a big gap between how one part of the team learns and how another part of the team learns. And when I say team, I guess let me expand that to include any relationship between people, you know, any collection of people, any group, community, nation, culture, etc. One of the great opportunities of these microcosms that we come across, where we bring people together, whether it's for an event like this, thank you, or it's the internet in itself. You know, in this limited slice of our existence on the planet, we're seeing now just that not only can we create lots of beautiful, meaningful things, you know, in instance, but we can also make ourselves miserable, and we've done that for ourselves and for um, you know, a lot of the life on this planet. But I think that's again um, a hint at space for fixing the bug in our collective cognition, you know, fixing the bug, the fault in our stars, so to speak, because some of the things that we take to be given are things that we ourselves create. And it can be really freeing to recognize the chains that we put on ourselves collectively and just call BS on it. And I guess when I say BS, I mean, I guess breadth search, you know, it's a computational, you know, it's a CS topic. Anyway, but no, I mean the real BS we tend to talk about, just that many of the norms, the social norms, the cognitive norms, the norms in language, the norms in habit, Many of them we protect implicitly. We don't question it. We don't think about it. Uh, some of us are not capable of really consciously processing what's happening on a subconscious level. That may be more common than not. And as such, we can't always vouch for ourselves fully, which is part of why there's such a strong call in the solutions and approaches that I recommend. There's such a strong call for a social aspect of the learning. So for example, any team that is looking to grow and welcome more kinds of people, if they're looking at DEI work, if they're looking at exploring belonging, hey, we want to welcome more neurodiverse people. We want to welcome more people of diverse identities and experiences and stories. Well, for many teams that are looking to do that newly, they stand to amplify a lot of harm. A lot of harm that, of course, was there before, but was not observed and discussed and reflected in policies, reflected in actions and goals and changes and impacts. So one of the things that we're able to do, if we're going to talk about security in a broad sense, is that we can start looking at threat modeling in a broader sense as well. What kinds of threats do we start calling threats when we're not modeling our sphere of protection on just the people in this room? What if we need to protect some folks that previously were on the other side of that barrier? And we can start asking questions about, like, at what point do we question, just working for protecting, just a dozen people? Like, do we have the resources, the imagination, the capability to protect like a community or a nation, like, or a planet, who knows? If we don't ask the questions, if we don't invest in hearing the stories, we're not necessarily going to hear from the folks who've already done the work and said, oh yeah, we can protect the planet. We just have to do these 7 things. We're never going to hear about that if we discount it.
It's too late for climate change now. I hate to sound like a real pessimist, but it really sounds like it's too late for climate change now.
So yes, that is a threat to model, and it's deeply supported as an anthropogenic thing. So that said, yeah, I don't know if Scotty's going to show up and kind of beam us to a moon for a few months to clean up the planet real quick, but yeah, we're doing a great job of driving this thing into a tree.
Don't believe a single word that Elon Musk says.
Oh.
I hate to get all political here, but there are few things I despise more than kissing the asses of billionaires.
Well, that's not your job, I mean, and if you were going to take on that work, charge what you're worth. All right. That's like top tier capital you would be getting. But yeah, there's no need to do that. There are machines that can do that for them. I would say, doesn't need to be any shame in that in general. But yeah, I think it does matter really deeply that we step back, and to the extent that we can, not just individually, but collectively, really quick here, that we do step back and that we start questioning our notions of the in-group and the out-group. We start questioning our notions of, who should be here and who shouldn't be here. We start questioning our notions of who needs to have a voice in this process. So in teams where I've worked in before, to wrap this up, I've encouraged the people whose title might be like office manager or assistant, to have a voice in our product process, and to let those suggestions be things that we be accountable to, because when we exclude those voices beyond the limitations of what we can handle, we basically ensure security fails, and we ensure harm that is outside of our security model. So with that said, hey, it's about 10 past, 5 past almost, and so maybe we wrap up unless anyone has any other questions, and especially complaints. Ooh, please give me a complaint.
I don't have any complaints. Honestly, I was happy earlier in your talk when you mentioned the spoons metaphor.
Oh yeah.
That's specifically a disability concept.
Yes. So, for example, there are a lot of models between concepts of neurodiversity and and this, some people might find this unwelcome, financial modeling and physics, such that I use this in DAI consulting to help people to understand the importance of making room for neurodiversity and letting people know that they're already paying the cost of not making that room to support neurodiverse teams by highlighting that, for example, if we can talk about fiscal budget, monetary budget, and we can talk about not having enough money for a certain thing, but we're not having a dialogue about having the spoons for a certain thing in our team, then our models almost certainly don't warn us when we're putting too much on one person, or we're putting the wrong thing on one person. And so whatever our budgets are then, they have bugs in them. And we may be spending too much, already on other things which we could use to introduce the observability that allows us to make our workplace more welcoming and safer for the people that work in it. And the more we can do that for more types of people, then, and this can be said is supported by a number of different, types of studies, a number of different disciplines. When we establish belonging for more types of people, including, aspects of neurodiversity, then we're able to tap into our collective superpowers, the wisdom of the tribe, the village magic, so to speak. Like we can pick up a phone and Wakanda can beam up, and we can model what our goals really need to be as a team, and we can be accountable for that, and we can fix it. And what we do until we do that is that's not it.
I have really enjoyed your talk. I'm going to be uploading all of this content to YouTube, like static rather than like dynamic and live streaming.
Thank you.
And I guarantee you that I'm going to re-listen to your talk a couple of times. I bet you write really good poetry.
Thank you. This has been poetry for me too. But we're not going to take 10 minutes to compliment each other, okay?
Okay, so thank you very much. I am going to remove you from Zoom, and I'm just going to have my little closing statements here. Thank you so much, B.
Thank you. See you soon.
Okay. Hey, everyone. We've made it to nearly 7 hours of Disinfosec. I noticed that more people joined in Twitch and YouTube as time went on. So this has been quite an experience for me today. Like it's a first for me. It's the first time I've ever done any serious video streaming thing where I'm administering it rather than someone else. So I would, not only am I going to upload everything to YouTube for people to watch whenever they want, but I was seriously thinking about having future Disinfosec events. The speakers that we've had today have been really, really awesome. Like I'm impressed with the content. I tried my best reading some of my writing during my time slot, and I've learned a lot today. I hope everyone has learned a lot today. And congratulations to the two winners of She Hacks Purple application security courses. So I'm going to have Tanya Janka email the winners very soon. And so, yeah, if you go to the Disinfosec website, disinfosec.tech, I'm still going to leave the mailing list open if more people want to be added to the subscriber list. I noticed that a lot of people aren't getting their emails, because it gets caught in their spam filters. So you want to double check for that. And I'm going to maybe keep you guys posted. Well, you people posted about, maybe hosting something like this in another 6 months. Maybe we do like Disinfosec as an every 6 months thing. I swear I'm going to get better at running these things the more experience I get as time goes on. So I really, really appreciate everyone tuning in and taking part in this. Thanks to all the speakers. Thanks to everyone who's been patient with me and my technical issues. Thanks for all the people who have taken it in stride while I've eaten entire meals in front of my computer. And so thank you very much. So I think I am going to sign off here. It's probably going to take my PC forever to render all this video in a static format. So thank you very much, everyone. You've been cool. Feel free to email me or message me on Twitter, and I'd love to hear from everyone. Thank you. And we're off.